Welcome to a special America Decides edition of CBS News Primetime. I'm John Dickerson. Super Tuesday or Snoozer Tuesday. The vote in over a dozen states may match expectations, but the outcome could hardly be less vital. What to watch from Virginia to California in the biggest day for delegates.
One of the great advantages of being in a democratic society is the right to vote in this country, and people don't understand that you cannot complain if you do not vote.
What the next moves are for Biden, Trump, and Haley.
How blessed are we to live in a country where we don't anoint kings, where we do have conversations within our party about the direction we go.
There's never been a spirit like this, and I just want to say that I have never seen the Republican Party so unified as it is right now.
And what the likely nomination of a candidate who has tried to overthrow the democratic process will mean for the democratic process this time. Hello, and thank you for joining us. From the port cities of New England to the sandy shores of California, the faithful in America's two political parties are putting the final touches on their party nominees. People in 15 states and one territory are voting. Another state has already decided. That's in Iowa, where Democrats have already announced President Biden has won their mail-in caucuses. At this moment, polls have closed in two states, Virginia and Vermont. Just a half an hour from now, polls will close in North Carolina. For the Republicans, tonight is not expected to be an underdog story. Former President Donald Trump remains the clear frontrunner. He has defeated former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley in all but one of the nominating contests thus far. On the Democratic side, President Biden is widely expected to sweep tonight's contests. He has no major challengers. CBS News polling finds that for Republican voters, the economy is the #1 issue driving their vote choice, followed closely by the border and crime. For Democratic voters, their top two issues are the state of American democracy and the economy. We have a panel for this moment, and let me read the roster. Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett and Chief White House Correspondent Nancy Cordes have switched places with me, and they are now in New York City. Senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe is at the White House. And Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa is here in Washington. I'm delighted to be with all of you. Major, start with you. Set the stage. If the expectations of tonight are kind of, people think they know what they're going to be, what is tonight really about?
Well, as you indicated in the open, John, this is not a cliffhanger. There will be no trapdoor surprise come 11 o'clock tonight, something unexpected. Oh, my gosh, this happened and we never saw this coming. We know what's going to happen tonight. It will be a blanket victory for President Biden and a blanket victory in all likelihood for former President Trump, as both prepare to be well positioned to become the nominees of their party and set up a 2020 rematch. One of the underlying subplots, though, is what does unity look like? We heard in that soundbite from former President Trump, the Republican Party has never been so unified from his perspective. But it may be unified from his perspective, but how large is it? If Nikki Haley in several states tonight, if losing, still clocks in at 35%, that means the Republican Party is not, by definition, unified or unified enough to propel former President Trump to a general election victory. If former President Trump loses 20%, 10%, even 15% of decided Republican voters in the general election, have a very hard time beating President Biden, no matter what the polls currently say. On the other side, what does unity look like for President Biden? Is the Democratic coalition always and historically fractious, pulling apart in ways that the Biden campaign cannot glue back together in time for the convention in August and the general election come November? Some of the questions about that unity and cohesion in the Democratic Party might get some more insight tonight in some of the primary results.
And Nancy, let me ask you about that gluing together function. How do the Biden folks with their bottles of Elmer's glue over there look at tonight and the task they have before them coming out of tonight's results?
Well, on one hand, they'll be able to claim it's a great night no matter what, right? They'll be able to announce that he swept to victory in all of these states. He is running essentially unopposed. But that's a blessing and a curse in some ways. On one hand, yes, he doesn't have any major challengers hitting him from the left. On the other hand, it makes it difficult to rally enthusiasm, rally energy on the Democratic side because there just isn't much of a race. How do you encourage a Democratic voter to get out and vote for you in a primary when you're basically not running against anyone else. So they've got to look towards the general election and find ways to convey to their voters that the stakes are real, even if the general election is still months and months away, and that they need to start getting engaged. They need to start getting active now, because we know who the Republican nominee likely will be, and this is going to be a rematch from 2020.
And Ed, are there any concerns tonight from the Biden camp, the way there were in Michigan from last week? Any efforts or where low turnout might signal more of that weakness that Nancy talked about?
Well, they had high turnout overall in Michigan last week, and they were actually quite intrigued by that and impressed by it because it signals strong support for the president, even though 13% of that vote went uncommitted, in part to protest his stance on the war. The only place that could really be a factor tonight is in Minnesota, another state that has that option but isn't expected to see as big a turnout. In my conversations so far with Biden campaign officials tonight, they're looking at our exit polling already that shows in North Carolina, Virginia, and California, 3 of the states where we have the exit polling, but 3 states they care about for various reasons. They notice big chunks of those who showed up today to vote for Nikki Haley say they will not support the Republican nominee if that Republican nominee is Donald Trump. In other words, they feel that's potential growth space for them in those states, North Carolina especially, because that's the one that the Biden campaign would like to turn into a battleground state. It's encouraging for them in places like Virginia and California, where there will be competitive congressional and Senate races and other opportunities for Democrats down the ballot, should they be able to draw out Democratic and independent votes for them. They'll be watching the turnout numbers in those states and others tonight and looking for any other signs of depressed enthusiasm. But they would also point out, turnout has been healthy in Democratic primaries so far, maybe a little higher than some had expected.
Bob, what does Nikki Haley's candidacy tell us about the Republican Party right now, and what are her choices at the end of tonight, do you think?
Nikki Haley's campaign might be ending in the next couple of days if she doesn't have a surprise night tonight and really start to put together some wins. But the end of her campaign does not necessarily mean it's the end of her coalition or a movement of traditional Republicans either to sit home or maybe even vote for President Joe Biden. I've been talking to sources in Philadelphia, in the Pennsylvania area. You talk to people there, Biden supporters, and they say, what happens tonight in Northern Virginia, what happens tonight in the suburbs outside of Boston, this could be an indicator of what's going to be outside of Philadelphia in those collar counties, how it's going to be in the suburbs of Detroit, in swing states like Michigan moving forward. Tonight's important to see, do those Haley voters come out in droves, even if they're not winning delegates for her in these winner-take-all states? Could they be a warning sign for the Trump campaign? And in fact, we're already seeing some early numbers in the CBS exit polling that shows 78% of Haley supporters in North Carolina are not willing to support the Republican nominee. If that's the biggest indicator of a warning sign I've ever seen in exit polling today.
And then quickly jumping on top of that, over the weekend, former President Trump said, we don't want anybody from the Romney wing, only MAGA voters. Well, in North Carolina and Virginia, over 50% of the Republican voters said they weren't from MAGA. Doesn't he need somebody outside of MAGA if he's going to win in a general election?
You're not seeing a pivot yet from the Trump campaign to try to win over those Haley supporters. There's a belief that they'll ultimately come home to Trump. But at the same time, you have the Biden campaign putting such an emphasis on democracy and January 6th. That's an overture to those voters.
Major, is there a special window that opens after tonight? In other words, things will go into a quiet period till the conventions. Is there a political window that opens once it becomes pretty clear who it already has, but, once it gets locked in and who, is there a special window that opens tonight?
Yes, there is. And it's not going to be quiet between now and the conventions, John. It won't be quiet on the ground, and it won't be quiet on the airwaves. The Biden campaign has already made it clear to me and Nancy and others that they're going to start using the vast resources they have to begin advertising, whether it's digital or on television, to get their message out. And both campaigns know who voted in 2020. We had record presidential election turnout in 2020. And there's all sorts of micro-targeting information that both campaigns have. And there's going to be voter outreach that will be starting this month and continuing unabated until November. That voter contact will be repetitive, and it could be like so much voter contact that by the end of this campaign, people who are reaching out for the Trump or Biden campaigns are taking these folks out to dinner or something. I mean, it's going to be that kind of direct, that kind of repetitive, that kind of familiar, because they have all this time to get to know who those voters are that they can lock in and the potential ones they're trying to bring across.
Nancy and Ed, very quickly, because they're going to kill me for taking this time up, but there's a State of the Union coming up. How is the president planning to use that, and can he really?
He's going to use it as an opportunity to remind voters of his record and what he's done in the past few years. Polls show, even our own CBS News polling shows, that there are a lot of voters out there who still don't quite know what he's done. And so he's got this big platform all to himself on Thursday night to try to do that.
Ed, final
to avoid
word
murdering
quickly
you,
from
John. Yes, to avoid murdering you, John. We don't want that to happen. Two things happened today here at the White House that signal what's going to be in that speech. One, he had a focus on combating so-called junk fees across corporate America, corporate greed, in order to bring prices down and address the chronic concerns about inflation. The other, he kept pushing Israel and Hamas to get to a ceasefire deal, understanding his base wants him to do that, and increasingly most Americans do as well. Expect that that will be a big part of the speech as well on Thursday.
Thanks to all of you. I'd name you, but the viewers know who you are, and we're rushed. Thanks, gang. CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, is joining us from our data desk in New York. Anthony, hello. Busy, fast night. We're getting some results from Virginia. What do we know?
We are indeed. John, let me show you this. This is the early counted vote. There's just a smattering of votes in from a couple of places around. You know, if I show you the way our exit polls have looked at this race, just so we can be totally transparent about what we do here at the data desk, I want to show you this. This is our current estimate for each candidate from the exit poll, 58 to 39 in favor of Trump. That's why we rate it right now as lean Trump as we await some votes coming in. But what happens, John, is I put these bars here between a high water mark for Trump, which we think is actually as high as 68, all the way down to 48. And then this is the bar around the uncertainty right now of Nikki Haley's estimate. And I just want to show folks that because it's this overlap right in here that means this is a lean race and not a projection yet. The idea that there is still some overlap between the candidates' estimates, at least out of the exit poll. As more vote comes in, we may see these bars start to separate, and then maybe we get a projection here in Virginia, but that's where we are right now, John.
And what other contests are you keeping an eye on, Anthony?
Well, we're going to look tonight. We've got Vermont has closed. We are waiting for data in that. And then North Carolina is the next one. It comes up 7:30 Eastern is when that's going to close. There's a couple of things I'm watching out of that. And I'll take you over here really quickly to the exit polls, because this is going to be a theme through the night. This is the composition of the electorate. In this case, it's in Virginia. Yes, it's 60% Republican, but there were a lot of independents, self-identified, and even a lot of self-identified Democrats who came into this race. What does that do? Well, it may boost Nikki Haley's vote because she's gotten so strong support from both of those groups. Maybe they're trying to send a protest against Donald Trump. Maybe they're going where the action is. They feel this is a competitive primary. But that's key to watch because Donald Trump's going to argue he's got the bulk of Republicans, and in fact he does. But Nikki Haley's going to argue, well, she wins these kind of voters, which is why she actually does better in national matchups against Joe Biden, John.
And so just on that very point, before I let you go, Anthony, is it important then to know when we hear figures like 78% of Haley voters aren't going to vote for Trump, is it important then to look inside those numbers and go, wait a minute, how many of those people who won't vote for Trump are either Democrats or independents and not really Republican voters? Is that important information to know?
It's extremely important, and I'm glad you said it, because the fact is that for most of these Republicans, when you look at in the national polling, they generally go back over to Trump when you ask them about a Trump-Biden matchup. And historically, that's what's happened. Even in 2016, when some Republicans said they were dissatisfied with Trump as the nominee then, what happened back in November? It took a while, but they ultimately moved to Donald Trump. So that's one thing that we could be watching here. And yes, if the composition of these primaries, even though a lot of people say they won't necessarily support the Republican nominee, as you see here, if they're voting for Nikki Haley. Even though they say that, the months are long and there's a big campaign and there's going to be a lot of enticement for them to come back home, John.
And Anthony, before I let you go, since President Biden has no actual real challenger, is it possible at this hour to give us a ruling on Virginia or on Vermont?
Well, Virginia, yes. Virginia, we can say that Joe Biden, and I'll show you that right here. I'll give you the Democratic race. that's a check mark. So we put that in for Joe Biden. He's won Virginia right there. Vermont, not yet. We're still waiting for data. Look, we're not expecting a lot of surprises out of these races for Joe Biden. Some folks are going to watch where states have the ability to vote for uncommitted. They're going to watch that. But then it's a lot of political spin. What does the percent uncommitted mean? Is 10% bad for him? Is 15% bad for him? That's one where you get a little bit more up for interpretation than anything else, John.
And it looks like another tough night for Dean Phillips there, coming in, at least it looks at the moment, below Marianne Williamson, who's dropped out of the race. But we'll check back into that later. Anthony Salvanto, we'll see you later tonight. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.
As the results start to come in, Republican frontrunner Donald Trump is in West Palm Beach at Mar-a-Lago. His club, the former president, has won every Republican primary thus far, except for the District of Columbia. His advisors say they expect him to officially win enough delegates by March 19th, when 2/3 of all states will have voted. CBS News political correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns joins us now from Trump headquarters at Mar-a-Lago. So what's the energy like there in the room where they're expecting to have a victory evening?
Hey, John, good to be with you. Well, it very much feels like a celebratory atmosphere. The crowd is just starting to fill in, and this very much feels almost like an event to mark the end of the primary, which the Trump campaign is hoping that tonight's results send exactly that message. They're looking for a Super Tuesday sweep that not only solidifies Donald Trump's hold on the Republican Party, but also tries to force his last remaining rival, Nikki Haley, out of the race. And that's important because to kind of note the atmospherics here, John. This event compared to Nikki Haley, she doesn't have one tonight. She's not hosting any sort of event tonight. She has no events on her schedule coming up. And so this event here at Trump headquarters at Mar-a-Lago very much feels like a kickoff to a general election rematch with Biden.
And do you get any sense in the room, or, if this is the end of, effectively the end of the Haley campaign, you could imagine in a different kind of politics, the victor reaching out to the vanquished. Any sense of how Haley is conceived in the Trump campaign or in the room anyway, which might influence the route she takes after tonight?
It's really interesting to see Nikki Haley's path over the past couple of weeks. She has gone kind of full bore against Donald Trump and has essentially said, look, I don't care about my own political future in this Donald Trump era. I'm going to make these criticisms. And, attending lots of Trump rallies as I have, lots of Haley rallies as I have, Donald Trump supporters have a deep, visceral dislike of Nikki Haley. And they kind of see her as a traitor to Donald Trump and the party. And so there's really no love lost between these two rivals who used to serve together in the administration, of course. So we are still waiting to hear what Nikki Haley has planned for the rest of the week. But in terms of kind of a nod to her, I don't anticipate we will see that. He's been trying to push her out of the race, or at least get her to see kind of the writing on the wall here in terms of the math and the delegates.
Yes, it may not be a nod, but a shove. Caitlin Huey-Burns at Mar-a-Lago, thank you. Nikki Haley rose in a pre-Trump Republican Party, and tonight her immediate political future may be decided by an electorate that's remade itself in the image of the former president. Despite becoming the first woman to win a Republican primary Sunday, Haley has just 47 delegates to Donald Trump's 276, and with more than 800 delegates up for grabs on Tuesday and Trump on pace towards the nomination, Haley will have to decide whether to continue campaigning or turn the page on this chapter of her political career. CBS News campaign reporter Nidia Cavazos has been following the Haley campaign. She joins us now from its headquarters in Charleston, South Carolina. So there's not exactly a watch party. So what's it like there?
Well, John, it's pretty rare to be able to say that things are pretty quiet out on the campaign trail. It's usually never like this. But tonight, this is what it's like. There's no watch party for Haley tonight, despite the fact that it's just Super Tuesday. And, there's no events or public appearances for today and none for tomorrow in this post-Super Tuesday day. Now, as far as the Haley campaign, I've been in contact with them throughout the day, and they're describing this as a moment for them to, come together. Their entire entire team is now in Charleston area. So is Haley, and they're all going to be watching the returns together for tonight. They've also described what their atmosphere is like at their headquarters. They've said, you know, there's a lot of food, there's music playing, and it's sort of a happy moment. And they've also described themselves as happy warriors, even since this morning when we were pressing for, you know, is Haley going to be making any public remarks or anything like that? The answer was no, but they've described themselves as happy warriors. And now the official reason as to why Haley wasn't hosting a watch party tonight, as far as what the campaign is saying, they described this as a travel day since Haley was traveling back from Texas to South Carolina. But of course, you know, many can interpret this in different ways.
Yes, a travel day. That's clever. So let me ask you this, Nydia. Usually on a day where there's a lot of voting going on, you get phone calls, and instead of people talking about how happy they are, they say, well, if this easily probable thing happens, it's a huge win. They try to spin the outcome before it happens, which usually suggests that they are still in the game. Have you gotten any of that, or are they just talking about how happy and how much food they have?
Well, as far as the campaign today, they're pretty much just describing their atmosphere. They're saying, you know, it's a time for us to come together. There's food, there's games and everything like that. There's also music. We know that Haley is big on music. But in terms of what we define as a successful night for Haley, this is something that we've always been questioning her. And Haley is well aware of this. She says, I know I'm driving the media crazy as far as when am I going to drop out? What does success mean? And Haley has always said that her goal tonight is to remain competitive in this race. And when we've tried to press her on what exactly does competitive mean to you, she'll spin it back to the media and say, you know, you all have been defining who is competitive and who isn't competitive. So these are sort of her answers that we've been getting lately on the campaign trail. And I will add that it's been sort of a combative tone as far as what we're getting from Haley, given that she's been pressed over and over from multiple reporters, different events, different gaggles. You know, are you committing to more states and staying past Super Tuesday? But we don't get much from her. She says, my focus is Super Tuesday, and then we'll take it from there.
Nydia Cavazos reporting from the Haley campaign in Charleston, South Carolina. Thank you. Stay with CBS News all night long for continuing coverage of Super Tuesday. There will be a special edition of America Decides at 8 p.m. Eastern with the latest results. Some top campaign issues this year are taking place on the other side of the planet. How the U.S. responds to the Israel-Hamas war, aid to Gaza, and other foreign affairs are weighing on voters' minds as candidates and also on candidates' platforms. Plus, lawmakers demand a TikTok breakup, the new legislation that puts a ban on the table. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. We have some results from Super Tuesday. CBS News projects Donald Trump has won the Virginia GOP primary. There are 48 delegates at stake in that contest. After 3 days of negotiations between officials in Cairo, Gaza ceasefire discussions have stalled. The informal deadline for the ceasefire agreement, the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, is less than a week away. This comes as the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which couldn't appear to get any worse, is getting worse, as food and water are all but disappearing. The U.S. military, in response, carried out its second airdrop of humanitarian aid into Gaza on Tuesday. War and how a U.S. president responds to conflict is something we've explored a lot on Primetime, and now we are lucky to explore it with CBS News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent and Face the Nation moderator, Margaret Brennan. Margaret, it's great to see you.
Great to be with you.
Okay, so what's going on with these? What's going on with two things? One, the negotiations over a pause, ceasefire, whatever, and also what's going on with the Biden administration's language about ceasefires and pauses for 6 weeks and so forth.
How much time do you have?
Yes, I know. No, it's a complicated world.
To start us off in the cynical world of politics, where our minds are all tonight on Super Tuesday, I would focus heavily on the rhetoric. It is just rhetoric in terms of the change of that language by the Biden administration. They're now using the term ceasefire. That typically means an end to hostilities. That's not what they're talking about here. They're talking about a 6-week time duration. They're putting that end date on it because they were specifically referring back to the hostage talks. And within that deal that's on the table that Hamas has not fully rejected nor fully accepted yet, is a provision that would have this pause in fighting for 6 weeks, during which time aid would be surged in. One of the reasons why the United States emphasizes this is so important is not just to stop the killing of civilians, but to allow for the movement of aid through this 25-mile area of the Gaza Strip that is currently under siege by U.S. ally Israel. using U.S. paid for weapons. That's what's so extraordinary about the United States then using an airdrop to drop food into this very territory. And it brings us back to the politics of it. This is something that President Biden's coming under a lot of heat for, particularly from progressive Democrats within his party who say you should use that term ceasefire and actually mean end to hostilities, not just for 6 weeks.
Right. So just to put a finer point on it, your point is that this change in language using the term ceasefire is really a response to his own party, and that nothing has effectively changed in the status of negotiations. And a sign of an actual effective change would be if Biden said, we're going to stop giving you those weapons that you're using.
It would be. I'd add one caveat to this, which is certainly the diplomats' hope that a 6-week pause in fighting might provide a diplomatic opening to then negotiate an end to this conflict. But to be very clear here, the Israeli prime minister, as recently as 2 weeks ago on Face the Nation, said, no thanks, not interested. Hostage deal or not, I'm going into southern Gaza, into Rafah, which is what the United States is trying to also prevent or slow roll from happening. They want this pause, and they would like an end to the conflict, but they're not publicly calling for one. They're just saying hit pause for 6 weeks.
As I understood it, Biden's relationship with Netanyahu was always to buy him, in other words, support him fully in public, to buy him inside leverage.
The bear hug.
Right. Was he mistaken?
It is not clear what the bear hug got him. What White House officials would say is that by going and publicly embracing Benjamin Netanyahu, the longest-serving Israeli prime minister, who is currently overseeing the most right-wing government in the history of Israel, a coalition that is key to being able to hold together in order for him to stay in power. He's prime minister, not a president. That he has to play politics on so many different levels that there's always a three-ring circus when you are negotiating with him. It deeply, deeply frustrates the White House. By going and bear hugging him so quickly after the horrific attacks of October the 7th, Joe Biden, they would argue, bought more time. Delayed the invasion 10 days. They did get more specificity, but they still never got the Israeli government, the Netanyahu government, to specify exactly what success would mean, what an end state would look like, what the day after would look like. And they have been pressing for it from day one. So they didn't get any of those things.
Very quickly, Ukraine. What's the sense of urgency in getting this money to Ukraine that members of all parties say is so important?
This is what's crazy making, John, because you talk to the people who run those committees, Republicans and Democrats in Congress, who say it's absolutely beyond emergency. They needed it yesterday. And they can't quite tell you what the time frame is. The last time frame I heard for a potential vote would be March 22nd or thereabouts, bringing everything together to be about a funding deadline for the government as well. But Ukraine, in terms of what they need, Zelensky says it needs to be approved in March. He needs it by April. They run out of ammunition. They're already rationing ammunition. They can't get it from other places like in Europe. They can't produce it fast enough. The United States can. We used to be the arsenal of democracy. Republicans who are more conservative and traditional want to harken back to that. Speaker Johnson hasn't committed to putting that to a vote.
That was great. Thanks, Margaret. That was
fun.
Did I make it? You did. You did great. That's great. I want to do this all the time. I live in the wrong city. Thanks, Margaret. We have another race alert from Super Tuesday. CBS News projects Donald Trump will win the North Carolina GOP primary. CBS News also projects President Joe Biden will win the Democratic primary there. We'll have more results throughout the hour, and we'll check in with our Anthony Salvato from the data desk in a few moments. Candidates who win their party nominations have plenty of strengths, but they are not without their flaws, and their opponents are sure to seize on them. CBS News poll data will help us understand some of those weak spots and voter sentiment around those weak spots. We are streaming CBS News Primetime. Super Tuesday contests are making a historic rematch all but official between President Biden and former President Trump. According to a recent CBS News poll, Mr. Trump is the frontrunner for now. He leads the president by 4 points nationally. That's his largest lead to date. CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvato, joins us again from our data desk in New York. Hello again, Anthony.
Hey, John.
We're still 7 months away from the presidential election. Obviously, a lot can change. But let's start with the president's weak spots going into November. What are they if he's trying to fix them between now and then?
Well, let me start with this, John, because, you know, the way I figured it, I think you'll appreciate, if you've got two presidents and a former president, a current president in a rematch, then people aren't just comparing candidates, but they're probably comparing presidencies, right? So I asked, okay, look back, how do you remember the economy under Donald Trump? Because I figured the economy is the #1 issue. Well, what do people think he brings to the table? And look at this. I got 2/3 of voters saying they remember the Trump economy as good. That's important for two reasons. One is you compare it to how they rate the economy now, which is much higher than that. But the other part of it that's really interesting is, in fact, in 2018 and 2019, voters did at the time rate the economy as good. And then the pandemic hit, the shutdowns, views of the economy cratered. But those memories don't seem to be in here. And I wonder if that sets up a campaign dynamic. To your point about 7 months, does Joe Biden try to argue, hey, wait a second, in his view, maybe things weren't as good under Donald Trump as you remember? But he certainly has this gap here between that current rating and that memory, John.
Yeah, there's an amazing way in which COVID-19 has been absent. But as you say, it'll probably come back. OK, so now what are the challenges for Donald Trump if he is likely to become the nominee, as everyone expects? What does he have to fix?
Well, there's a couple of things that I think are important. And one is we're going to hear a lot about democracy, who's a threat to democracy. Both campaigns are going back and forth on that, right? Now, we know that when you ask people if they believe that Donald Trump tried to stay in office beyond his constitutionally allotted term and tried to do so by what they see as illegal means, this group of folks, it's 44% right now, they are overwhelmingly voting for Joe Biden. Okay, so that part is baked in. But to your question about what is a weakness for Donald Trump, if that number were to grow, and we see some echoes of that even in the exit polls now where we ask if Donald Trump were convicted of a crime, would he still be fit to be president? That all speaks to this dynamic because it cuts so directly to vote. And if you want to talk about a potential weakness, it may be that first and foremost. Does that number move if, in fact, he does get a conviction, if, in fact, the Biden campaign can further that argument about what happened after 2020, John?
Anthony Salvanto at the Data Desk. Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.
House lawmakers announced a bill that would force the company behind TikTok to divest from the Chinese government or face a ban in the United States. The bipartisan group says the social media app poses a national security risk due to ByteDance's ties to the Chinese government. TikTok U.S. told CBS News in a statement, quote, "This bill is an outright ban of TikTok, no matter how much the authors tried to disguise it. This legislation will trample the First Amendment rights of 170 million Americans and deprive 5 million small businesses of a platform they rely on to grow and create jobs." After the break, Super Tuesday marks 8 months until America decides who gets the White House. We're breaking down the state of the race and what happens between now and November. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Welcome back to CBS News Primetime. You are looking at Minneapolis, Minnesota. Polls there closed at 9 p.m. Eastern on this Super Tuesday. At stake are 39 GOP and 75 Democratic delegates. Tonight's results will give us a clearer picture of what's going to happen in November, a general election race that is actually on the mind of most Americans. CBS News polling shows 50% of registered voters think about the race a lot, 36% think about it some. But what does all that thinking mean for the election itself? To help us break down the state of the race in voters' minds, Lynn Vavreck joins us from Los Angeles. She's a Marvin Hoffenberg Professor of American Politics at UCLA. She's also written co-authored indispensable books examining the 2012, 2016, and 2020 presidential races. Lynn, it's good to be with you again. When you look at this election, the first of its kind since 1892, two-thirds of the country says they don't really want to see another Trump-Biden rematch. What do you think about are some of the most important things that we should keep in mind about the electorate as we head towards November?
I think that you're right. Every day we hear about nearly everyone in the population wishes that this race could look and take shape differently than it is. But I think that it would be a mistake to make the inference that that means people won't care when November comes along, that people are going to stay home. I think wrapped up in all of that is the very real belief by nearly everyone that a lot is at stake. And so I wouldn't confuse those two things, the lack of enthusiasm for the candidates with the lack of realizing how important the contest is.
Such a great point. Give me a sense of how closely people are paying attention to the race now, and then help me understand at this stage of the race How much should we pay attention to these head-to-head matchups in polling, and also the numbers inside of a lot of polls about how various constituent groups feel about their likely party nominees?
Yes. As you keep saying and reminding viewers, it's 8 months away, and that is a long time, and a lot is going to happen between now and then. And so I suspect you will see these numbers tightening. They may be wide right now for lots of reasons, one of which is that the Republicans have had a bit of a contest, and that keeps those candidates in the news and keeps voters engaged in that contest. And the presumed Republican nominee has been in the news a lot, rallying his supporters because of these legal proceedings. And all of that is important. That really does remind voters, hey, you are for me. Don't forget that. Now, Joe Biden is president. He's in the news all the time, but he's not in a fight either with an opponent or with the legal system. And I think that's a factor here, too. And I think those gaps are going to close.
And so, as a final question, Lynn, does Biden have to assemble a pro-Biden coalition or an anti-Trump coalition? And a version of the same question for Trump. Is he building a pro-Trump coalition or an anti-Biden coalition?
Yes, both. Both to both. And so in this election, if we had to make one prediction, I think we could all agree that it is going to be very close. 2016 was close. 2020 was closer by half. This one's going to be close. So you want to take and get every vote you can any way legally that you can get it. So both your proponents and the people who don't like your opponent, take them all.
All right, Lynn Vavreck, thank you so much again for helping us understand some of this. And we're going to take a quick break right now. When we come back, we'll take a hard look at the health of our democracy and the challenges facing it across the country this week. You're streaming CBS News Primetime. Millions of Americans from coast to coast are exercising their centuries-old right to vote, but that right that so many take for granted could be at risk from attacks, both domestic and international. CBS News election law contributor David Becker joins us now to update us on this question. David, we were having these conversations in 2020, so let's bring us up to date. How would you rate the health of the U.S. electoral system at this moment?
Well, in reality, the actual health of our system is very, very strong. We have more voters who have access to easier ways to vote than ever before. More voters have access to things like online voter registration and same-day registration, even automatic voter registration than ever before. More voters have access to no-excuse mail ballots or early voting than ever before. And our system is also more secure than it ever has been. We have more paper ballots, which can be reviewed and verified and audited and recounted than ever before in American history. 95% of all ballots cast in America are on paper, including all of the ballots cast in battleground states. Those ballots are audited. We have systems in place to protect against fraud better than ever before. But of course, the irony is that losing candidates are still spreading lies about how secure our system is in an effort to undermine confidence in our election system, and that's causing us some distress.
And David, you listed in that list of how healthy the system was two things, which is one, it's easier to register to vote, and it's easier to vote. There are some politicians who make that seem like it's a bad thing, that too much access to the ballot is something to be suspicious about.
Yeah, it's really baffling to understand why that's the case. I mean, if you look back at leaders of this country, whether they be Democratic or Republican, people like Ronald Reagan, they really took the opportunity to persuade the American public and win large majorities as a challenge and something that they wanted to seek as a mandate. And now we look at some officials trying to undermine that to some degree. I think largely they're failing. I think the American voter is very resilient and is going to push back against some of these efforts. And as I said, in most places, the reality is it's pretty darn easy to vote, easier than it's ever been, and it's more secure than ever.
And so if you were to think about places where the right to vote is threatened, what are some of the greatest challenges to American democracy right now?
Well, there are some who under the auspices of the lies about the 2020 and to some degree the 2022 elections, are pushing policies that are really bad for election integrity, like hand counting ballots, which is less accurate and takes much, much longer. And you can imagine, as ballots are taking longer to count, how losing candidates might spread lies about that process in order to incite violence. It's important we try to count ballots as quickly as possible while understanding that our ballots are very complex. We're not going to know the results of very close races on election night. It might take days. So just being aware of the reality of running an election in the United States of America in 10,000 different jurisdictions with 100,000 election workers, with 1 million volunteers, with 160 million voters on multiple page ballots, and having some understanding and empathy for, in particular, the public servants who run those elections and have done a remarkable job even under incredible stress.
The Republican Party recoiled after January 6th, which was a day of certifying the vote. But now a lot of those who did recoil have endorsed former President Trump, who they criticized shortly after the 6th. The party is behind him. How does the treatment of January 6th as a shock to the American system, that treatment which has changed from 2021 to where we are today, how does that change affect, or does it not affect at all, the overall health of American democracy with respect to the vote?
Well, I don't think it changes the reality of the actual health of our election system, but certainly the false perception of that election system, the lies spread about elections, the attempts to undermine our confidence in our democracy, the attempts to bully and threaten public servants, election officials, and others all over the country, that does damage to our system overall. And we've seen so many people of principle, Republicans and Democrats. I think about people like Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and Bill Gates, the Maricopa County Supervisor, who've stood for truth and principle. Even though they supported the former president at times, they have voted for the former president at times, and that's the best of the American spirit. I think we're going to see that shining through in 2024.
And finally, David, the battleground states, we're all going to be paying a great deal of attention to them. Is it? Do you have an assessment about the health of those 7 or so states? Is there one we should be paying attention to, one where there might be a situation in a state of flux?
I think several of the states are in really good shape. I mentioned Georgia. I think Georgia's doing a remarkably strong job. I think Arizona and Nevada are doing pretty good jobs. I think states I'm really keeping an eye on, in particular, are North Carolina and Wisconsin. I think those are states where there has been some undermining of confidence, some by elected leaders. There are efforts to change laws for reasons that are not particularly strong, that might weaken the integrity of the system. There's a law that's currently under review by the North Carolina Supreme Court that would change the entire structure of election governance there. We need to watch those things very closely, because what all elected officials and all Americans should want is an election where we know the result, we accept the results, where the rules are set in advance and cannot be leveraged by the losing candidate to try to cast doubt.
David Becker, CBS News election analyst. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, John.
Up next, a special edition of America Decides, anchored by my colleague, Major Garrett, as we start to get more Super Tuesday results. I'll be back at 11 p.m. Eastern for a special edition of CBS News Primetime. From all of us in the newsroom, thank you for spending the hour with us.